Ford built a city, Volkswagen built a ranch, the Amazon buried them both. I'm Arturo, and this is LatinLora, from Latin America's history, to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. The forest remembers. Before we do, they said engineers paved the road to modernity, but in the Amazon, we learned something different. Here the road is cut by machetes, patrolled by rifles, and haunted by the ash of trees that once breathed for us all. And on an August morning in 2025, under heat so heavy it made the jungle hum like a memory half recalled, a gavel fell in the courtroom of Redenção, and the forest answered back, not with thunder, with remembering. Judge Otávio Bruno da Silva Ferreira spoke aloud what had lived in whispers for nearly 50 years, that on a ranch bearing the Volkswagen crest in Santana do Araguaia, between the rule of generals and the fading echoes of the Cold War, men had been worked like beasts, paid in debt, and held in conditions analogous to slavery. The court demanded an apology, a promise of zero tolerance, and 165 million reais in damages, blood money filtered through the bureaucracy, deposited into a public fund. Volkswagen vowed to appeal. Of course it did. The forest has heard many promises. It can wait for one more. What the ruling unearthed was not a scandal. It was a blueprint, the kind Latin America knows too well. Debt that begins as an advance and calcifies into chains. Camps stitched together with black plastic, where men slept with fever instead of blankets. Armed checkpoints that turned open land into a prison without walls. A store that devoured wages faster than hunger devoured flesh. And behind it all, the gleam of cattle eyes. The ghost of profit, a machine designed not just to erase forests, but to replace them. And the judge's words, wrapped in legalism, cracked open memories that never learned how to stay buried. Boys had once boarded trucks thinking they'd found work, and ended up inside an engine greased with their own fear. But this wasn't the first time the forest had been told to make way for progress, and it wasn't the first time it answered with rot and rebellion. The first appetite, sap long before cattle trod the bones of the Amazon, another hunger came dressed as civilization. It came not with hooves, but with sap. Hevea brasiliensis, the rubber tree. In 1744, a Frenchman with powdered hair and scientific ambition, Charles-Marie de la Condamine, stood before the Académie in Paris and gave a Latin name to what the forest had always known. And with that name, Europe began to dream. In 1836, a Yankee by the name of Charles Goodyear, a man possessed like a prophet and mad like a poet, discovered how to harden the sap with sulfur and heat. Vulcanization, rubber that could stretch, bend, obey, soldier to industry, servant to speed. And then came the thief, smiling, with official papers, Henry Alexander Wickham. In 1876, he lived 3 years in Santarém, downriver from where later misfortunes would bloom. He filled crates with 70,000 seeds, stolen from Boehm, and shipped them off to London under the blessing of the empire. Only 2,700 germinated, a mere 3.8%. But from those few sprang plantations in Malaya that would one day steal Brazil's monopoly and steal Manaus's breath. The rubber barons in the Amazon wore white suits and invisible blood. They built opera houses on top of unpaid labor and called it destiny. Manaus and Belém swelled like lungs in a fever. And across the western edge, in a place where Colombia, Peru, and Brazil all whisper the same breath, Julio Cesar Arana carved out a private hell. From 1896 to 1905, he took 3 million hectares of native rubber lands and turned them into open-air death camps. In just 12 years, the indigenous population dropped from 30,000 to less than 8,000. 4,000 tons of rubber left that jungle. $75 million appeared in bank accounts far from the trees. Somewhere, a colonial accountant did the math. 180 kilos of rubber per murdered body. That's not economics, that's theology, written in blood. The forest bled and the world applauded. But the wheel of capital spins fast. When the 2,700 seedlings from Wickham's crates bloomed into orderly rows in Asia, the geography of power shifted. Brazilian monopoly cracked, prices plummeted, and the cities that had once danced on sap found themselves abandoned by it. People said, the grass grew in the streets of Manaus, but maybe the grass was never the problem. Maybe it was the forest coming back to take a breath. The man who tried to tame the wild. By the 1920s, in a far-off city of metal and thunder called Dearborn, the factory hummed like prophecy. Henry Ford's machines birthed more than cars. They birthed a rhythm. Every hour was subdivided. Every worker was a cog. Every material had a place, except for rubber. The price kept rising. A colonial cartel had a stranglehold. Ford looked at the ledgers and saw red ink. Then he looked at a map and saw rivers. He didn't see a forest. He saw a supply chain. In 1927, he made his move. Through a coffee baron's heir and a North American fixer, Ford acquired 1 million hectares in the Tapajos Basin, land the Brazilian state might have given him for free had he bothered to ask. But Ford did not ask. Ford never asked. He named his dream Fordlândia, a word that sounded like a prayer and a punchline. By December 1928, the Lake Ormoc and Lake Farge sailed upriver, their bellies full of prefab dreams. A city in crates. They unloaded Dearborn's logic into Amazonian mud. Barracks rose beside bungalows. A water tower pointed at the sun. A hospital, a warehouse, a church, a mess hall, and a pharmacy sharing the same roof. An obedient little cinema to project northern dreams onto southern walls. Hydrants, ventilators, telephones. It looked for one bright moment like a pact with the future. Then the forest sent its letter. In 1929, 400 hectares were cleared, 900 more the following year. It was the first significant slash of continuous deforestation. The men in suits imagined selling the hardwood to Europe and the United States. But the market laughed. The trees were too stubborn, the sawmill too big. Most of the lumber stayed in Ford's buildings, or went to the fires that kept the boilers warm. The absolute failure was deeper. The first Americans sent to manage the dream were doctors, engineers, drafters, and accountants. Not one was a botanist. Not one knew what Hevea wanted, or what it would refuse. They hired a brilliant polyglot Amazonense named Monteiro da Costa to lead the planting. But they gave him no lab, no tools, no authority, just orders. And in that silence, the forest sharpened its blade. Microcyclus ule, maldas folas, a humble fungus, born in Amazonian air, stepped out from the understory and began to feast. It found row after row of vulnerable hosts. In the mist and the mud, it celebrated. The leaves turned brown and dropped. The latex vanished from the veins. With every fallen leaf, the dream of Fordlândia withered. The soil was all wrong. The topography is unforgiving. The river dropped in the dry season and stranded deep draft ships long before they could load. No one had asked the trees if they wanted to be soldiers. The forest politely withdrew its consent, and it did so one leaf at a time. The green table of Belterra. By 1934, the ledger had begun to smell of rot. Ford needed a man who could name the failure. Enter James R. Weir, a scientist with a steady hand and the grim task of confirming what the forest had already declared. Fordlândia was dying. The blight, he wrote, was not a surprise. It was inevitable. The lack of spacing, the wrong clones, the naive planting, all mistakes written in rows. He recommended starting again. Higher ground, better clones, more humility. So Ford shifted his hope. 50 kilometers south of Santarém, he found a plateau. Belterra, a green table 150 meters above the river. The earth was firmer, the water is deeper, navigation is held year-round. This time they brought Southeast Asian clones, pre-selected seed, and a strategy. Crown grafting, fungicides, agronomy, discipline. And by 1941, the first trees at Belterra gave up their latex. But it was too little, too late. Yields were poor, costs were high, and war had changed the rules. Synthetic rubber, once the stuff of laboratory whispers, became national policy. The Anglo-American alliance pivoted. Empire restructured its appetite. Rubber at the end of a Brazilian river, no matter how disciplined, no longer made economic sense. And Ford, the older man who once thought he could civilize a jungle with blueprints and time clocks, looked toward the river and saw only retreat. In 1945, after 18 years of insisting the Amazon could be tamed like a factory floor, he quit. The silence after the machines. The end wore a suit and a signature. On December 24, 1945, Christmas Eve, a decree, Lei 82440, signed over Ford's dream to the Brazilian state. The Banco de Crédito da Borracha paid a symbolic 5 million cruzeiros, roughly $250,000, for a project that had swallowed $20 million US. On paper, it looked like a triumph of infrastructure. 2 hospitals, 6 schools, sanitation patrols, treated water, power plants, 70 kilometers of road, 2 ports, thousands of homes, warehouses, research centers, more than 5 million rubber trees planted across Fordlândia and Belterra. But paper doesn't measure memory. Paper doesn't measure how it felt when the Americans left and took their urgency with them. An old agronomist remembered when they arrived in 1928, it felt like a revolution. When they left in 45, it felt like a new silence, poorer than the one before. Fordlândia today is a ghost with a spine. The water tower still rises, glaring like an abandoned lighthouse. The houses sag in the heat, breathing out the faint smell of kerosene and disinfectant. The hospital windows are blank as dead eyes. Once it was styled the third city of the Amazon. Now it's a district of Aveiro with 1,700 souls and too many stories. Belterra fared better. It was granted political emancipation in 1997. It thrives in its way. But both towns remain written in someone else's handwriting. Ford drew the map. The forest merely survived it. And the automobile, restless as ever, changed its hunger. The second appetite, meat. If Ford came for sap, the next empire came for blood. In the 1970s, Brazil's military dictatorship carved highways through the green like scalpels through a living body. They called it development, a euphemism so sharp it could draw blood without raising its voice. The generals wanted pasture, so they offered incentives, tax breaks, state loans, logistical support, all under the pretext of integrating the Amazon into the nation. They promised roads where there had been rivers, they promised order where there had been wildness, and corporations came, multinationals, ranchers, banks, Volkswagen Brazil, then the continent's largest automaker, was among the first to answer. It christened a subsidiary, Companhia Vale do Rio Cristalino, and secured an immense parcel of land in Santana do Araguaia, southeast Pará. The company's German president announced to cameras and microphones in 1974, "The world needs not only cars, but also meat." That sentence hovered over the jungle like a storm cloud waiting to burst. To realize their dream, they needed to clear the forest faster than it could regrow. And to do that, they needed workers. So they summoned the gatos. Labor recruiters with claws made of debt and teeth made of lies. They moved through poor towns with promises that sounded like rescue. They offered advances, money, rice, a pair of boots. They loaded trucks under the setting sun. And they drove toward a geography that did not forgive. 2 names became infamous, whispered like spells that summoned dread. Francisco Chico Andrade Chagas, Abilio Abilão Dias Araujo. Their tools were credit, deception, and coercion. Their method was isolation. Their enforcement was a rifle. The Volkswagen Ranch was a prison in everything but name. Near the headquarters, executives lived well, ventilated homes with trimmed lawns. A school named after company president Wolfgang Sauer stood like a monument to corporate paternalism. A store sold goods at subsidized rates. But farther out, past the smiles, past the fences, were the camps. There, dozens of kilometers from the illusion of civility, men slept beneath black plastic sheets. They drank from streams that gave them fever. They worked 6-7 days a week with machetes in their calloused hands and a rifle never far from sight. Wages vanished in the store ledger. Sickness became debt. Attempted escape invited pursuit. The forest, once a refuge, had become a perimeter of captivity. You cannot leave, they were told. The road will kill you before we do. And many believed it. Some never made it out to know the difference. In a place like the Amazon, memory has to be stubborn. The rain wants to wash it away. The heat wants to melt it. The fear wants to bury it. But in 1977, a priest arrived in the Araguaia region who refused to let memory drown. His name was Ricardo Rezende Figueira. He was not the kind of priest who mistook prayer for passivity. He had the fire of liberation theology in his chest, the type that doesn't kneel before injustice but walks straight into its teeth. As the director of the Pastoral Land Commission in Conceição do Araguaia, he became a human archive. He stapled a notebook beside every ringing phone. He wrote things down that others preferred to forget. He knew that memory without paper was a raft in a flood, so he built a bridge. When a case seemed like it smelled like truth, he brought in the witness and took their statement in front of others. When it reeked, he marched that statement to a notary or the police. Rarely did it lead to an investigation, but the pages piled up, testimony over testimony. Dust settled on them like patience. And inside a metal filing cabinet that looked ordinary from the outside, the jungle's darkest secrets thundered. Then came the call that every chronicler hears in their bones before the phone rings. In April 1983, 5 boys escaped the Volkswagen ranch. They had crossed the border into Canabrava do Norte, Mato Grosso. They were childhood friends, still carrying boyish faces, yet their bodies had already learned the grammar of fever and fear. Resende flew to find them. They said they had been recruited with promises of wages and even a soccer field. That cruel little detail, so specific, so false, deserved its own category of betrayal. They had never played once. Instead, they were sold to Chico, watched by armed overseers, and folded into a system where malaria was foreman and defiance a death sentence. One, Pedro Vasconcelos, remembered finding a body in the woods, tied up and beaten. Others told of a man shot in the leg, of a woman raped as punishment for her husband's attempt to flee. They believed over 600 men were still trapped on the ranch. Resende carried their story to Governor Jader Barbalho of Pará. He was turned away. So he went to Brasilia. He stood before the National Bishops' Conference. The next morning, the headline cut through the fog. Priest says there are slaves on Volks farm. The curtain rips. Volkswagen denied everything and staged a performance of transparency. They invited journalists, investigators, and Resende himself to the ranch. He went, and what he found was a paradox polished to a gleam. Near the headquarters, they were shown manicured lawns, brick houses, a swimming pool, a restaurant, and a club. Something like Brasilia in miniature, he would later call it. But the camps were kept off the tour. Even in a stage-managed visit, the real world sometimes rips through the curtain. As Resende walked the grounds of the model town, a man, burning with malaria, approached and whispered into his ear, "Save me." Later, the ranch's director, a Swiss man named Friedrich Georg Brugger, offered the defense of every system that feeds on silence. The brutality wasn't theirs. It was the Gatos. Volkswagen, he insisted, only monitored progress, not people. He even defended the use of violence as a tool to maintain order. On the road out, by accident or fate, the group crossed paths with Abilo in a white Chevrolet truck. He wore a cowboy hat and a cross around his neck, playing the part of rural innocence. He claimed his men were vagabonds, that he had merely used energy, not violence. He bragged that only 16 of his 408 workers had managed to escape that year. In the back of his truck sat one of them, a captured fugitive. He looked Resende in the eye and said what the entire system had been built to obscure. "I owe money. I have to pay up." The dictatorship fell in 1985. Volkswagen ceded control of the ranch in 1986. The story faded, except in one metal cabinet. There, in the priest's Rio de Janeiro office, were more than 1,000 pages, testimonies, clippings in Portuguese, French, German, notarized declarations, police statements, court filings, lawmaker reports, 69 victims, a mapped escape of 155 kilometers, names, routes, pay stubs, scars. And then, in 2019, a headline surfaced. Volkswagen admits role in dictatorship-era persecution of factory workers. If they were ready to reckon with that truth, maybe they were prepared to face the forest. Resende contacted federal prosecutor Rafael Garcia. Garcia had never heard of the ranch. The priest sent him the archive. Garcia's hands trembled as he turned the pages. He called his colleague, Cristian Nogueira. They launched an inquiry. A graduate student, Mateus Faustino, traced the victims. He found the 5 boys, now older men in Canabrava do Norte. Their stories had not changed. He found brothers split like livestock. He found a man living alone with scars instead of a family. In December 2023, the prosecutors filed their case. Volkswagen denied it all. But in Redenção, the older men testified. "We were sold," said one. "We slept under black plastic," said another. "They were all armed," said a third. And the priest rose. He told the court what he had been telling a silent nation for 40 years. And this time, the law listened. On August 29, 2025, a judge in Redenção gave memory its voice. He ruled that Volkswagen, through its subsidiary, had subjected workers to slavery-like conditions. He ordered an apology, he ordered a fund, he ordered the truth. Volkswagen vowed to appeal. Of course they did. The forest is used to waiting, but not forgetting, not this time, because now the court had written the word aloud, slavery, and now we all know. And no one, not priest, nor survivor, nor tree, can be told to be silent again. Gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.